Hi there, it's Richard Little from your land partner. I'm going to talk today about flood risk, what we look at when we're doing our initial assessment, part of the appraisal process. Flood risk is split into two distinct areas. One is flood risk from rivers, seas, and the other is from rainwater, stormwater effectively. Yeah. So if we tackle the flood risk from rivers and seas, firstly, there's categories 1, 2, 3A and 3B. You can build, it's possible to build in any of the categories. 3A and 3B are the ones that get more problematic, but this very much depends. People will get used to what the flood risks are in certain areas. It depends what part of the country you're in. There are parts of the country where they will be building quite regularly in 2 and sometimes 3, because that is where a lot of the land is. And other areas that you've got no chance of building in 3A and 3B. So, it's like a lot of things with development. What it is like in one area is not necessarily the same as in any other area. So we'd all suggest that when you're looking at an opportunity, at the right point, you'll have a look at the flood risk maps or the flood maps. Now, in many areas, most areas, there's often 2 sets. Now, Environment Agency, so stuff on .gov.uk websites, environments, you can pretty much find everything on there. But what we would also say is that you need to check what perhaps one of the local authorities, county councils, whatever, in different areas, they can also produce their own. And the warning here is they don't always match. Yeah. So I think the other thing about this is, as we all know, development takes a long time, so we might be looking at a site and actually not getting to the point of perhaps concluding a deal and maybe getting planning in for 6 months, a year, 2 years, and way longer than that. So flood maps change, and they change a lot more frequently than most people realise. So you need to, at key points in the whole process, so initially you're looking at it for that initial assessment to give us what it is at that particular point, but actually as we move through, certainly once you get into scheme design, etc., so periodically you just need to check, and certainly before you actually submit an application you want to check, is it the same? We've had, and we're not the only people, where it changes whilst the application is in process. That then gives you an issue of you might have been complying, but actually now you're not. We had that, as recently as I think last year or maybe the year before, gave us a bit of an issue. So flood risk for rivers and seas, so generally you've got a bit of an idea where they're likely to be. They're going to be near the sea and near rivers, and reservoirs, and that comes into that as well. So it's sort of pretty easy to spot generally, and then if you're a lot higher than the rivers and the seas, then you're less likely to be in a flood zone. So low-lying areas are likely to be in a flood zone. As I say, just to repeat it, you might be in flood 1, 2, 3A or 3B. That does not mean to say that you can't build. However, if an area is primarily in perhaps flood zone 1, or a lot of the land is in flood zone 1, or not in a flood zone at all, then you're going to struggle to get permission to build on anything in that area that's in a 2 or a 3A or a 3, or definitely not a 3A or a 3B. But the flip side of that is, if you're in an area where a lot of the land, there's certain large parts of Reading, for instance, as an example, that are in flood zone 1, you're more likely to get, easier consent, if you like, in flood zone 1 and 2, and 3A and 3B is a bit more complicated anyway. Now, a few things about if you do look for consent and gain consent in those flood risk areas is whilst you might be able to get consent for it, which is sometimes a hard fought sort of battle. What you've got to think about is it going to have any implications on demand? Is it going to have any implications on insurance, for instance, and undoubtedly will? Is it going to have any implication on some of the costs like warranties, etc.? Is it going to have any implications on mortgage availability? And the answer to that is, yeah, it might do. So let's sort of just bear that in mind. As I say, at the minute we're talking about it purely from the initial assessment, but we will look into it quite closely. So if we put that side of flood, so rivers and seas, to one side, let's now look at the other one, which often gets missed off, which is the stormwater, the rainwater. Yeah. Now, that doesn't have to be in low-lying land. So we've got one that's virtually at the top of a hill, you know, or a slope, quite a long, slow slope, but it rises many meters from the main road, and to almost to the top of the hill there is a flood issue in terms of stormwater. So that's a localised issue where in fact the drains are blocking or can't cope with all of the rainwater that can fall. So these are sometimes much more problematic, but we need to know them. So don't make the assumption because the piece of land, the building you're looking at is a long way from the river or sea, you're not going to have a flood issue. Now, localised flood problems in terms of stormwater, rainwater can be a lot more difficult to overcome. And whether you are looking to build in, whether it's a flood from rivers and seas or it's from rainwater, stormwater, then you may have to build, or you're very likely to have to build differently. So some of the materials we're going to use are sort of so that they will last a flood, they will take a flood. So there are implications in terms of specification of materials, etc. So really, what we're actually saying, as I say, at the initial assessment stage, it's getting an understanding of a particular site and how close it is to any potential flood lines, any flood mapping. As I said before, it does change, can change, so periodically check if you take an opportunity and you move forward through it and perhaps structure a deal and get into planning, etc. So let's just make sure that we're checking on key points at key stages. But initially we are looking for, if this is in, say in a lot of areas we work, if it's in a flood zone 2 or 3A, that'll all from our point of view, traffic light system, that will be pretty much an amber. Shall we have a little look into it or won't we? And in many areas, if it's a 3A, 3B, we'll just move on. Doesn't mean to say that somebody might not get consent, but it just means for us it's probably not worth the effort, the resource that it's going to take to actually do that. So it depends what you're looking to do, obviously. So be very mindful of flood. So that information is all there. It's easy, doesn't even cost anything. You can get that information, but actually, again, it's one of those things. If it's easy to do, it's easy not to do. I'll pick that up later, or somebody else. Now, who's going to be responsible for getting that information? If you've got a good team of consultants, they'll want to know. They'll want a flood report somewhere along the lines to sort of say, well, okay, what are we looking at? But not everybody's that conscientious. So if you don't look at it at initial appraisal, then you're missing an opportunity to potentially say no. And if you remember, most of the things we do, we are always looking for a reason not to do it so we can move on. And flood is one of those that for us is certainly an amber and often a red light, which means move on to the next opportunity. So just to recap, 2 types of flood that you need to look for: rivers and seas, and then rainwater, stormwater. People call it different things in different areas, and that information, there's sometimes two sets of mapping. So Environment Agency through .gov.uk websites, and also through local authority and district authority platforms as well. And so they haven't all got it, but some have. Some interactive maps on local authorities are brilliant. They show it all, etc., and it's updated, etc., but not always. So the other key thing is, remember, it can change. We've suffered from this at least 3 times in relatively recent years, and it causes a delay in the planning process because we have to come back out again, etc. Have we been unlucky? Yeah, maybe, don't know, but we're not the only ones that get this. So as ever, you know, this is initial assessment stage. So, as I say, very easy to pick this information up, and interpreting it is not that difficult either. But it's information that you might want to pass on if you're working with, you know, planning consultants, architects, surveyors, or whatever, that are perhaps helping you through this process if you're not familiar with it and you want to know what the implications are of. Yeah. So the other thing is, it's different in every area. So don't listen to somebody that works in that principally works in one area that is different to yours, because it might be different. So you'll be listening to them and it makes sense, and they might be saying you can or you can't. But actually, in your area, it could be the opposite to that. So it's not necessarily helpful. So it's local knowledge here. You know, that's key in most things that we do. So that's been Richard Little. Or I've been Richard Little even, of Your Land Partner, talking about flood risk. We will go into that in a lot more detail further down in this video series, but that's pretty much all you need to know and be aware of in terms of the initial assessment. So Richard Little saying good night.